Here come the drums. Welcome to the Mark Peterson Show, the show that takes news, views, and parapolitics and wraps them all together from a blackish point of view. Welcome to episode 14, in which I have entitled, Black Firms Are Not Getting Their Fair Share of Work, and It's Our Fault. This episode was inspired by an August 12, 2019 article written by John Gallagher in the Detroit Free Press entitled Black Firms Aren't Getting a Fair Share of Work in Detroit, and a group wants to change that. The article starts out by saying Detroit mayors since Coleman Young have tried mightily to create more business opportunity for minority firms in the city. But even after 40 years of executive orders, hiring goals, and outreach programs, minority businesses say they still struggle to participate fully in Detroit's redevelopment efforts. The article goes on to talk about a brand new nonprofit effort called Detroit Coalition for Economic Inclusion, and the organization hopes to change what was stated earlier as a 40-year problem. The article quotes Ken Harris, the national president and CEO of the National Business League, an organization of black-owned firms, where he says, when we take a look at where we were in the 1970s, we have really moved the needle in terms of access to capital, capacity building, but you're still seeing some of the same systemic barriers to entry and limitation to access to opportunity. Greg Bowens, a spokesman for the new coalition, this Detroit Coalition for Economic Inclusion, says that it's not just minority construction firms that miss out on big development jobs in the city, but black-owned law firms, security guards, and other types of small businesses that supply services to major developments, from signage and printing to landscaping, are also missing out on opportunities. Bowen goes on to say that Detroit looks like it has a cottage industry of the same old companies doing the same work on every project. Now, here's why that's miserable in Detroit. 80% of Detroit is black, and they have 49,000 black-owned businesses that operate in the city. The article goes on to cite even successful businesses that have broken into the infrastructure and are getting contracts, say they find it hard to repeat their success. They point to Adrian Bennett, the president and CEO of Benkari plumbing contractor, that got a chance to work on Little Caesars Arena and on the Ford renovation of the Michigan Central Station. And she cites that despite winning contracts with both of those major initiatives, that she's struggling to get follow-on work. Her son cites anecdotal evidence in saying that he often sees trucks from suburban construction companies parked in front of these major projects in a city that's 80% black, with almost 50,000 operating black businesses. Now, I keep emphasizing the fact that the city is 80% black because that means at every level of city government, there should be representation that reflects the community, right? Which would mean 80% of elected officials should be black, or at least representing black interest, but that's not happening. Now, who do you blame in that scenario? You can't yell racism because 80% of everybody you see walking around in the city limits looks like you. Who do you blame? Well, the article goes on to make some very compelling arguments as to why black firms are not getting more of the opportunities in a major city like Detroit. The first being cost. Yes, certification. For any of you who bid on government contracts, you have to be a certified vendor. And if you're trying to get set-asides for your company as a minority or a women-owned business, you have to go through the certification process, which has several steps that must be in place for you to get that designation, including auditable financials, a certain corporate structure, And then you have to apply for recognition through associations that are accepted by the city government. That could cost thousands of dollars to have a consultant and lawyers help you get through that process. But once through, you're eligible now to bid on contracts, both at the state and federal level, that will look for minority representation in them. Now, the process could take anywhere from 60 to 90 days. So it's not an immediate turnkey type solution. You have to work your way through the process. The second element that was pointed out in the article as to why black firms are missing out is technology. Yeah, I'm from that realm of the world, worked with big companies that put in sophisticated vendor management systems and forced all of the vendors that wanted to work with them to integrate to that vendor management system platform so that they could order directly through the system and have supplies accounted for, discounts baked in, with fewer and fewer people involved in the process. It's all about cost savings from the side of the large corporation or cities that use this sort of infrastructure. And if you can't afford to integrate, you get left out of the process. Clear as day. The final reason that's pointed to as to why these firms are not getting the opportunities in Detroit is doubts about capacity. I remember sitting in a meeting with Walmart and talking to them about their international vendors that they use to provide many products that you find on the floor. One of the things that the manager stated was, as a risk, was we don't want to give contracts to factories that may be at peak capacity because we could put ourselves in jeopardy of forcing human rights atrocities just by giving them a contract thinking we're helping. He went on to say, domestically, we hate putting that same burden on companies because one contract the size that Walmart would put out would essentially mean we own that business because we bought all their capacity. If we choose not to buy from them, they go out of business. And that's a real concern if you are selling merchandise the customers want and you can't replenish it because that particular vendor now is maxed out. And that's a real problem with small firms wanting to be big, is that how do you solve the chicken and egg problem? So these are the three reasons cited why you are not getting the traction in Detroit that you would want from the 49,000 businesses operating within the city limits. Why they're not playing nice with all the big contracts that are available to them as they redevelop the city. You know what I'm talking about. Dan Gilbert and all his guys that came in from Cleveland and that are now rebuilding the city. They're not getting the participation from black firms for the reasons that they're citing here. I'm going to tell you that's only the tip of the iceberg when thinking about the issues that affect our ability to win economic contracts and develop sound business infrastructure in the black community. And you may not like it, and you may not like me for saying it, but it's our fault. Okay, before you start calling me a Tom Turkey and serving me up for Thanksgiving, let's break down some of the facts. When is the last time you have seen a black politician campaign on building out a black economic plan that ensured that every black business in that community would increase employment just by one person per firm? You haven't heard it. Because none of the black politicians consider economic redevelopment when running for office. It's never been a prominent part of their campaign platform. You're not hearing it with any of the presidential candidates. They haven't even done the analysis to understand what's at the root of the unemployment problem in the black community. The problem is black businesses can't and don't expand their employment enough to reduce the gap in employment in the black community. Yeah. Black unemployment is typically double the national average because black-owned firms aren't hiring at the same level as their white counterparts. If they did, black unemployment would come in at the same level, at the same rate as all other groups. Yeah. So knowing that, the presidential candidates should be giving you plans that will stimulate that type of growth to give those firms the confidence to make just one additional hire. Now think about it. Detroit has 49,000 operating businesses. If each of them hired one person, that's 50,000 new jobs. What is that on par with? That's on par with getting a Ford plant, 2 of them, put right into downtown. And yet not a single politician, federal, state, or local, will analyze that from that perspective and come up with serious plans to stimulate growth amongst businesses for people who make up 80% of that town. What are they going to do? Give you fish sandwiches, come to your church, do backflips, and tell you God's going to make it all right. Whereas everywhere else, they are building the infrastructure for the economic future. So that's where I start with the first problem. The second problem has already been outlined in excruciating detail by Gary Johnson in blackmenamerica.com. A June 22nd, 2019 article. I will put both of these articles in the show notes so that you can go through it for yourself. But Johnson points out a fact that I love to quote all the time is, how do your dollars circulate in your community? Yeah. How many times does a dollar turn over in your community before it leaves your community? In the Asian community, a dollar will turn over 30 days, will stay in the community 30 days before it leaves the community. In the Jewish community, it takes a 20-day lap around the community. In white communities, it takes a 17-day lap before it leaves the community. Now, any guesses on how long it stays in the black community? If you said it took just 1 day for a dollar to circulate in the black community, you would be wrong. It takes a little over the time it takes to watch an NFL football game to circulate in the black community. 6 hours, according to Johnson's article. So if you get overtime in a football game, that's about the length of time it takes for a dollar to circulate in the black community. So why aren't black businesses getting opportunities for major projects? One real reason is they can't even get small projects in their own community. If dollars aren't circulating, how do you expect to get the capacity if you aren't even getting your own capacity? 6 hours. Guys, I'm not stupid. I do know that there has been systemic racism that have kept blacks from building wealth in this nation. Redlining, Jim Crow laws, you name it. There have been continued efforts to keep us out of the economic wealth building mainstream. In fact, Johnson does a very good job in the article of citing statistics that point to that. America's 100 richest people control more wealth than all of the black community. And that's a stat that's coming from an article that he cited in motherjones.com from 2015. I think that number's actually dropped to 40 families or 40 people have enough wealth or more wealth than everyone in the black community in just 4 years, dropping by 60 people only takes 40 to round up the $1.3 trillion that is generated by the entire Black community. Jones goes on to say that it would take 228 years for the average Black family to build the wealth that you see in the white community today in 2019. But we're never going to close that gap until we learn how to spend appropriately. Johnson in this article cites several categories where we overspend based on the percentage of wealth that we represent in America. Health and beauty aids, women's fragrances, feminine products, men's toiletries, refrigerated juices and drinks. You go on down the list and you look at the percentage of dollars we invest in these categories, and it's greater than the 14% that we make up in the population and in the total wealth that we generate relative to others. So we're over-investing in industries where we have no physical infrastructure invested in those. We don't have a company that makes health and beauty aid products that would capture all the dollars that are spent by the Black community, or a juice company, or a prepared meats company, or soap and bath needs, or cookware or detergents, all of these that we overspend on. So how do you ever expect to build wealth when we overspend in areas where we should be investing? Because we have very little equity, no equity, and in the next 2 to 3 years, if stats are correct, we will be operating in the negative equity zone. Yeah, I know. Isn't that crazy? So what else am I recommending? Well, we can't look to politicians to develop economic plans. We've pretty much determined that. But the one thing I would like to see is that the organizations that we have develop new purposes, new missions that are all structured on trying to create larger and bigger businesses to focus on the things that we do control. What do we control? First, how many Black churches are built in America? What's the total impact, dollar spend on those churches? And then how many of those are built by construction firms that are now being excluded for these major projects? What if there were 1 or 2 major Black construction firms that had an 80 to 90% market share amongst Black churches built across the entire United States? If they had that, would they be able to compete for these larger jobs? Absolutely. So why can't we make that happen? What if organizations like the National Business League and the National Urban League and the NAACP stop telling us about how much white business we're not getting and put their efforts towards helping Black firms do something you never read about? Certainly not on Bloomberg and certainly not on CNBC, which is partnering or acquiring other firms so that you can have capacity. When's the last time you've heard of a Black construction company buying another Black construction company in order to build capacity and move into other markets? Let's make it simpler. When was the last time you saw a barbershop buy another barbershop? When was the last time you've heard of any Black businesses operating in the same category, sitting down together and procuring their supplies as a single unit so that the price per unit goes down because the order size goes up? What if the NAACP, the Urban League, the National Business League did that instead of complaining about the amount of white business we don't get? What if all of those firms went out and talked to all of the athletes, entertainers who now have equity funds and venture funds and said, let's try to pool those in a way or direct our investments in a way where we can have significant impacts in communities that have momentum. Because right now we're all over the board with no direction, no strategy, no focus. And so we are not seeing the impact that moves the needle. When I lived in D.C., and I may have told this story on an earlier episode, but damn it, I'm going to tell it again. The Million Man March could have been so much more if a million men showed up with just $1 in their pocket, ready to invest it in Black-owned businesses that wanted to grow. Wow. That hit you then right between the eyes, right? Yeah, what if at night there was a Shark Tank style pitch contest in front of a million Black men who would vote by holding up $1 and buying a fractional share in the company that pitched in front of them? Now, back then, who were the type of businesses that could have pitched and benefited from that sort of investment? BET. Right there in DC, right? Could have pitched, taken $1 million or more and put it into infrastructure and reflected what that million men wanted in that platform. Now that business went on to be sold for a little bit over $1 billion. And those men would have gotten a great return for that $1 investment had that occurred. And then the model would really be working. So why couldn't that idea have germinated and manifest itself at the Million Man March? Because we are programmed to want symbol over substance. That's not me. You know who said that. Malcolm X. So if we put on our thinking caps and really examine the problems, we can get to plans that move the dial. And that's why I say it's on us. Forget systemic racism. That only works when you play in their system. There's a big enough system of our own if our dollars circulated more than 6 hours in the community. Now, all of this stuff sounds great, right? That should be bouncing around in your head. When was the last time a politician in the Black community sponsored a think tank focused on economic issues that would help set the agenda for the Black community? You know it happens all the time in communities outside of the Black community. You got think tanks out the wazoo, both left and right, exploring every issue under the sun. And yet not one politician that you can name has proposed or funded a think tank to solve these issues. Guys, I'm not making this up. But as a strategy consultant, I'm going to take on this task. I'm going to start to research and put out plans and white papers that will point to where the opportunities lie and lay out a high-level plan on how we capture it. I'm going to come back here to the mic and share those with you, and then I'm going to post them on my consulting firm's website, Ceyero.com, Ceyero.com, and ask politicians to comment on them, to share them, to develop their own, use it in any way possible to to create a dialogue that leads to some real traction. I think we can do this. I think we can do this. Guys, before I hear the drums, I want to tell you about something I'm doing with Airbnb. I'm teaming up with Airbnb Open Homes, a program that enables community members to offer free temporary housing to people displaced by disasters. And no community knows more about disasters than ours. I don't even have to remind you of Katrina. I'll tell you about the most recent storm, Tropical Storm Barry, that hit Louisiana, and it showed that one of the greatest needs we have is to make sure that residents have a safe place to stay. Hurricane season is already on top of us, so now is the time to prepare. If you can offer free temporary housing for neighbors impacted by disasters, sign up to be an Open Homes host by going to airbnb.com/M Peterson. That's airbnb.com/M as in Mary, Peterson. You'll only be contacted when there is a need. This will add a great tool to our community's disaster response toolbox. Guys, if you like this show, you may also like some of my other podcasts. Gorillapreneur. Yeah, Gorillapreneur. If you're the type of entrepreneur that can take another man's junk and turn it into treasure, that's the show for you. We're talking to all the best startups out there and finding out how they're using the sharing economy to take on the giants. There's gigging, everything in the sharing economy. If you want to learn more about the sharing economy and what's really happening that's going to impact your community, check that podcast out. And then finally, if you're not ready to make the leap into being an entrepreneur or starting your own business, but have your eyes on the corner office, check out Career Coaching X's and O's. All of these podcasts can be found on Spreaker, iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, or any of the other podcast platforms that you love. Guys, I'm hearing the drums. That means I probably overstayed my time with you. But I've enjoyed it, and I appreciate you tuning in. This is the Mark Peterson Show, and I am your host, Mark Anthony Peterson.
Hey you, podcast listener. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. Take the blue pill. You wake up in your bed and go back to listening to mundane podcasts that won't challenge your religious beliefs and your so-called truths about reality, the universe, and consciousness. Take the red pill. Subscribe to the Event Horizon podcast, hosted by Mark Anthony Peterson, and he will show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. Event Horizon takes a walk into the paranormal with a splash of conspiracy. It's the podcast that would be born if David Icke and the X-Files had a baby. Subscribe to the Event Horizon podcast by Mark Anthony Peterson on Spreaker, iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Castbox, Stitcher, or any of your other favorite podcast platforms. Remember, all we are offering is the truth, nothing more.